Well, there's a growing recognition even in the United States that Africa not only has bountiful natural resources, but is going to be, I think, a hub of consumerism and workforce development in the future. This statistic that you hear bandied about all the time, that within a few years 25% of the world's workforce will be African, is very meaningful, not only because of the contribution that Africans will make to global development, but also because of the purchases that Africans will make as global consumers. And I think the countries that are wisest, and unfortunately this does not include the United States for the most part, the countries that are wisest are getting in now because they see a chance to be early comers in various market segments, and to start developing some consumer loyalty that will serve them very well in the coming years. That is always very much the case and always a fear, because the nature of capitalism is not kind. Capitalism and development are sometimes at odds with each other. And I think there's much to criticize in the old Chinese model, to be sure. That being said, however, I think increasingly nations like China are engaging with Africa as partners, with the intention of making profits for everyone. That's not to say that there aren't tremendous flaws remaining, but I do think that the African nations are doing a much better job at demanding terms that benefit their people. This is a slow evolution. It takes time. But, I have seen a lot of change in the way that China, for example, is engaging in Africa. 5 or 10 years ago, it was not common to see Chinese firms hiring large numbers of African workers, but they're obliged to do it today because the African publics will not tolerate Chinese companies coming into Africa, which they tried to do, and not hiring African nationals to do the work. In future, it may be that when China wants to do a deal in Africa, they won't be able to use Chinese firms. That African publics will say, you know what, you have to use African companies to implement this project. I believe that's coming. It's an excellent question, and I would point out that American multinational firms like Coca-Cola, for example, have been in Africa for decades, decade on decade. And so I think it's important to draw a distinction between these large companies that have always been on the African continent and then the small and medium enterprises, the SMEs, which indeed have not, in the American case, come to Africa in large numbers. And I think that is, in large part, racism may play a role. I think they also have a hard time envisioning the profit margins at this stage that they can develop in the American context quite easily. And also, it does require an entirely different way of working to be in Africa. And I think that a lot of American firms, particularly the middle-sized American firms, they haven't had the opportunity to develop the resources and the methodologies that would assist them in working in Africa, particularly because they perceive Africa as being more risky than it is. And I think that's primarily the problem, is that American firms think of Africa still as risky for governance and security reasons. It is. No, it is entirely. But geographically, those are closer. Yeah, it does not make sense. And I think that there are a lot of American think tanks and American businesses that are trying to pioneer the idea that Africa is not particularly risky politically. But the information hasn't penetrated so far.